Okay, good morning. So, one college summer, I visited my hominy in Kansas. Hominy just means grandma in Korean. And I went to her church one Sunday, and her church is a Korean church. It's really cool. Every Sunday they have lunch afterwards, and it's delicious. But after the service, many of the older women, the hominies, the grandmas, started coming up to me and trying to give me money. Oh, thank you so much. But I was really taken aback, and I was like, oh, no, thank you. Like, I don't know why you're giving me money. I mean, I am a poor college student. But I was just really confused. And so I kept refusing, and like the same people kept saying, no, take it. And you're like, ah. By the third time, each time, I respectfully took it because I didn't know what else to do, because I felt like I was disrespecting them by not taking the money. So I later on told my hominy about what had happened, and she was like, oh, that was good. She said, refuse 3 times and then take the money. and I was like, okay, yeah, somehow I had passed some test or some unspoken rule that, that was going on. And so, yes, yay me, cultural norm. I have a quarter Korean, and so I'm like, I rocked it. But this was one of many cultural norms that is in a Korean culture, right? And this morning, I thought it would be a good thing to think about and ask you guys, what might be some of our cultural norms in our society? They could be unspoken, they could be spoken, rules, whatever. What do you share? I'll give an example, if that helps. Growing up, my granddaddy used to say, if you're 10 minutes early, you're on time, and if you're on time, you're late. Do we have any similar? Yeah. That is true. Go ahead. Yeah. Absolutely. There's also in the South, and this is probably other cultures too, you start to say goodbye, and then you 30 minutes more have a conversation, but it's not officially over until the third goodbye. There's this great book called Foreign to Familiar. It's by Sarah Lanier. I'm hoping I'm not butchering her name, but it sounds pretty when I say it that way. That looks at cross-cultural dynamics. She divides the culture into hot and cold climates. And in these climates, she talks about how they operate differently in regards to time, hospitality, identity, and community. There are these rules, spoken and unspoken, that form and structure each society so that they follow a certain rhythm. And this is why it can be really hard for any one person to enter a whole nother culture different from their own, to live there. They can experience culture shock, and they will experience culture shock. And it's because of these different cultures with their different rules coming together of the way they believe to live life. These rhythms define how our society views time and money and status, and where and to whom our values are devoted. So in our passage this morning, we hear Jesus washing the disciples' feet. And this doesn't seem like a big deal. And it might be a big deal to you if you're not a feet person, But reading at first glance, that doesn't really seem like a big deal. Oh my gosh, you just washed feet. At least not to us. However, Jesus washing the disciples' feet went against the culture's order and structure of what society deemed as acceptable and as honorable. In one of Jesus' last controversial moments with the disciples, it is marked by him deconstructing these societal norms, and he's going against the wave and inviting his disciples to participate in a humiliating act of love through service. So let's just backtrack just a little bit. In Jesus' time, if we can imagine, Israel's roads were for the majority not paved. They were dirt and sometimes maybe mud. The typical footwear of the time was sandals. And as you can probably imagine then, feet were filthy. They were dirty, they were gross. And so being in someone's home, if you were invited as a hospitable act, at some point they would wash your feet. Now, the washing of the feet was then very important. It was essential in welcoming house guests. And the only people permitted to wash the feet were women, children, and Gentile slaves. Not even Jewish slaves were permitted to wash feet. This was a job, but it was not a respected, nor was an honorable thing to do. It was seen as for the lowest of people to do. It was dirty, and it was a demeaning task to be done by the people that really in that society didn't hold very much significance in their society. So now again, imagine, here we are at the table. Jesus is at the dinner table. We're having supper. Jesus gets up from the supper table. And in John 13, 4 through 5, it says, he laid aside his outer garments and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Recall, Jesus is what? He is a Jewish man, a teacher, a leader, the Messiah. And Jesus is stepping into a role of a servant, which again in his society is considered demeaning and humiliating to do. This is front page of the tabloids. It's a scandal. Oh my gosh. Can you imagine? We're sitting at the table and what is he doing? What is he doing? It is unheard of. Our teacher, our Messiah, is about to wash our feet. And can you imagine how the disciples felt? Can you imagine just a confusion, but also like I'm following you kind of moment? Can you imagine the questions that filled the air? This was uncomfortable and foreign. Again, what was Jesus doing? People of high regard do not do this. People who were respected, who were valued in their community, never would stoop to the level that Jesus was placing himself. And that's why we can hear it, like when Peter responds, he's like, what? No, you're not going to do that. So we can hear, he was the one who voiced it. But these are the questions that are going throughout this whole table. What is Jesus asking his disciples to be a part of? They've been following him this whole time. And do we understand what Jesus is doing? And if we don't, that's okay. Because I believe that Jesus, he does go on to, through John chapter 13, go to clarify and explain a little bit more. He goes on to say in verses 14 through 17, if I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I've given you an example that you should also do as I have done to you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. Jesus, at this point, was specifically speaking to his friends in a time and place where washing feet, when done by someone who was respected, was crossing boundaries. It was shameful to do. They were supposed to be above it. And we could easily get stuck on the singular idea of just washing feet and say, this is what we must do. However, I think we might miss the point. He wants them to understand that it goes much further than just washing the feet. It's by the end of John, when we read in chapter 34 and 35, that he says that he's giving them a new commandment. He's calling them to love one another. And just as he's loved us, just as he was loving them, he wants them to do and reciprocate the same love for each other. And what does he say? By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. So then, maybe not just washing feet, right? Jesus is specifically talking about this with the disciples and how to love each other. We can think about it. Jesus has taught us about how to love the enemy. He's taught us how to love the stranger. He's taught us about how to love the neighbor. But it's almost like he said, but don't forget, remember that this community that you have right here, you need to love them as well. This is kind of where you start and how it's able to expand out to the other people around you. There is a type of love that is demonstrated by Jesus in a way that shows love to those whom we serve, with those who we call brothers and sisters in Christ. And I know we can tend to use that word can be very churchy, brothers and sisters in Christ, but this is a family. This is what, when we said we love Jesus and we believe in him, this is what we've been invited into a much bigger family. You see, I believe Jesus is calling us and really challenging us to an uncomfortable kind of love for one another. The washing of the feet was just an example of an uncomfortable love that was happening there. You see, washing the feet of his disciples made everyone in the room uncomfortable, well, except for Jesus. He knew what he was doing. But this was not dignified in the eyes of their culture. He is inviting them to treat one another, care for one another, serve one another in a way that is going to look different, despite the criticism and despite the judgments that will come their way and despite their very own pride. I believe that in our time now, that Jesus is calling us to, as well, into an uncomfortable alternative, like foot washing of love. Like, how do we love in a way that's similar to foot washing, right? And I say that because I don't think foot washing carries the same weight in our culture. And so what does it mean to serve in a way that might actually be costly for us? Something I was thinking about, and this might be kind of generic, but I don't think it is. I think our time is a good example. I think we can tend to say that we want to serve one another, but when it comes not, you needed help, but I happen to have some space and time for myself right now. I think God challenges us in those moments to love one another with our time, to say that it's not about me, it's about the whole. Some other ways of crossing boundaries in our time is, for example, this one's, I think, a little more we can work on, is parents do things for their babies and kids, right? That might be considered kind of gross. We deal with changing diapers and all kinds of bodily fluids. And at some point before, when you go, oh, that's gross, and you're in the midst of it and you've done it, you're like, it's not a big deal. But then there's a point. We're aging, time goes. And that's what kids then often have to do for their aging parents, right? But in the same way that Jewish slaves weren't allowed to wash feet because it was beneath them, many adult children, there are times, won't care for their aging parents. At least not in the ways that might be undignified or embarrassing. And so we often pay people. There were often times that when I used to work as a caregiver long ago at Heritage, that sometimes the families there, the people that I would care for, their parents just put them there, and they never saw them maybe like once a year, and they lived close. Like, so there are some circumstances, but they lived close. And the comment all the time that I heard was, "We've come here to die." I'm like, devastated. But anyway, so I just think there's some challenges there. That's a real world example of like how we can love each other in a costly way. So think about family. Now realize what Jesus is saying again at this table, and you are all family. Jesus looks around at his followers and urges them as family to love and serve each other in the undignified and embarrassing ways that even biological family members can't bring themselves to do. Wash each other's dirty feet, and maybe clean each other's shorts when you're no longer able to clean yourself. I believe we can care for one another. I believe we can love each other as Jesus wants us to. I think sometimes we can put limits as well on the love that we are supposed to have for one another. And I think what Jesus does here with Judas is really important to note, because many times we say that, you know what, they have just hurt me too many times. And in our human ways, we want to protect ourselves and we want to put those boundaries up. But part of loving everyone in this family is knowing that sometimes you might experience a betrayal. You might get hurt. And really, you will probably get hurt. The flesh is not something we are called to protect. Jesus still loved Judas. He knew in the moment that he washed his feet and dried them that he was going to betray him. These are the last moments. He didn't call him out in front of the disciples. And Judas knew it was him. Judas still received the love that Jesus had. But I don't know that he fully received it, because I think if he had, he would have gone a different way. But I believe that Jesus is giving us an example of an unlimited amount of love for one another. This is the example he shows us. And I know that this is very hard. But it's radical, and it's different, and it's growing, and it's kingdom seeking. So I'm going to wrap up. But I wanted to wrap up with this verse in Romans 12:10. And it says, love one another with brotherly affection. And it talks about outdoing one another and showing honor. Outdoing each other and showing love. And we've heard this, Curtis has spoke about this many times throughout the last few years about outdoing one another. Can we outdo one another in one anothering? And so let's try, and then where we feel like it's really hard, it's okay. And to pray and give that to God and to ask him for help where you feel like you can't love.